Hello, you're listening to the After Aston I podcast. For the astute among you, you might be thinking, that doesn't sound like Katrina. You would be correct. My name is Abby, and I'm usually in the background of our podcast recordings, making sure things are running smoothly. But today, Katrina is sadly poorly, and so we've told her to go back to bed and get lots of rest. So you've got me today, and you've also got Geoff. Geoff and I are joined by Aston alumnus Paul Matthews, who is joining us in our online studio all the way from Australia.
Paul graduated from Aston in 1997. Since then, he spent over 2 decades in the corporate world in the UK and Australia, before taking the plunge and setting up his own leadership coaching practice in Australia. He's helped thousands of leaders go further by having powerful conversations with themselves, with each other, and with their teams, boosting impact, trust, and results. Paul is now a well-known speaker, mentor, coach, and author of 3 books, including a top 10 bestseller. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
You've been living in Australia, working in Australia for quite a long time now, haven't you?
Yes, I've been here about 15 years, actually. Although it's gone really quickly, it doesn't seem that long at all.
What took you there in the first place?
I think a search for a better quality of life, better standard of living, but also the allure of the beach suburbs, beach life, the shiny, bright lights of Sydney is what drew me, I guess.
That better life, better standard of living, does that, if this is going too cod psychological already, but does that connect to some of your work? Does that inform your thinking? Has that always been something important to you?
It wasn't in my early career, but definitely much more now. I'm very, acutely focused on having what I call, and lots of my peers call, a life by design. So designing work around my life rather than life around work. And I think in somewhere like Australia, where you've got, lots of sunshine, lots of open space, lots of outdoors activities, which I'm interested in, it's much easier to do.
That sounds amazing. That's the kind of life that I could go for. We've actually got blue skies today, and it makes such a difference. So yeah, you make me want to go to Australia, Paul. So getting down to the business side of things, you worked in the corporate world for a couple of decades. What sort of roles were you doing, and at what point did you decide to set up on your own?
Well, I've done quite a few different roles, actually. After I graduated from Aston, I worked in events and event management for a little while and transitioned into marketing. And after that, I went to work in pure communications, so PR and internal communications for actually central government. I worked in Tony Blair's government for a really long time, channeling communications and building culture change across the NHS. So I've worked in communications, marketing, events, and at that point moved to Australia, where I became a head of communications, had a few roles both in the public and private sector out here, and eventually transitioned to a senior leader. So managing large teams in organizations and becoming a director of communications before I set up my leadership practice. But I've moved around sectors. So I've had similar roles in communications, but I've worked in logistics, healthcare, shipping, ports, transport, utilities. But I guess one of the big themes is around the people and the organizational cultures. That's what's really been the golden thread throughout my career.
It sounds like you've had a fascinating career across all those different sectors. Was it when you became a senior leader that you realised that you could make a big impact by focusing on leadership and communication when you set up on your own?
I guess, yeah, it's the flip of that. I felt like I always wanted to be a director of communication, managing the reputation of an organization, helping it communicate. But actually, the further up the tree that I got, the less communication I did. So it was more a focus of when I had a seat at the executive table, my focus was more around governance. It was more around contracts. It was more around issues. And I found that I'd moved away, quite far away from the things that I was really most interested in. So I decided that I would have a much greater impact if I worked one-on-one with individual leaders or small groups as a coach, rather than trying to steer communication culture in an enormous organization.
You do a lot of different things through your practice, all focused on helping people be better leaders, boost impacts, increase results. Is there an area of leadership, or when you're in these, say, these close sessions or working one-to-one, is there an area that you see time and time again where you think that could be better, or a recurring theme that you always or almost always notice when people come to you for help?
There certainly is, Geoff. And I feel this with myself sometimes too, but every single leader that I talk to has to work on what we call mindset. And for those that aren't aware what that is, it's basically the conversation we have with ourselves. And I talk about powerful conversations in my book. Guess we'll get to that in a little while. But the most powerful conversation you can have is not a difficult conversation. It's not a performance conversation with your manager. It's actually the one you have with yourself. Your inner voice is something that, if you master, can really propel you forward. But what I see often in many of my clients, be they senior executives, middle managers, or frontline leaders, Geoff, is that they have what I call limiting beliefs. So they might believe that they can't do something without legitimate reason. They might have tried it once or twice and failed. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling story. So getting your self-talk right, and sometimes using a mantra. I always tell the story about during the pandemic, like most people, I piled on the pounds a little bit and decided to get back on the treadmill. And when I did, I was slower and sluggish than I'd ever been before. And a friend of mine says, you need a mantra. Get on there and in your head, have that self-belief that you're going to go further and faster. So I got back on the treadmill and I said to myself, I'm good enough, I'm getting better. I'm good enough, I'm getting better. And in that session, I ran further and faster than I had for about 18 months. So the conversation we have with ourselves is something I see that everyone can actually work on. Moving past the negative self-talk removes a lot of barriers for every leader.
Do you ever encounter initial resistance? Words like mantra, there's an old school mindset that people might naturally be resistant or immediately go, oh no, this is woo, wishy-washy. Or is it that it's not so much there if they've already come to you in the first place? They've read the resume.
So I think you got to pick your audience. I wouldn't necessarily use the word mantra with a senior executive. I'm using it here because it's accessible. Most people know what that means. But when we talk about, the conversation you have in your head, your self-talk, I think that's probably makes it more accessible. So you're absolutely right. There's always an element of resistance when we talk about growth and self-improvement, because there's no growth without vulnerability, or in order to be courageous, you've got to move through fear. So definitely seen a lot of resistance, particularly around growth and getting better, because it can be hard.
I feel like that's a really good practical piece of advice that people can use in all aspects of their life, isn't it? It's business, but it's also at home. Yeah, I've had anxiety in the past, and I got into the habit of every morning saying to myself, I can handle anything. I can handle anything. So then you begin to believe it, don't you? So then when curveballs get thrown your way, you believe that you can handle it. Whereas perhaps before you'd be like, oh no, I don't know if I can. And maybe I'm not there.
I totally agree, Abby. And there's a little framework which I use and I ask leaders all the time. Is that decision you're making based on fear? Is it based on comfort? Or is it based on courage? Because we're kind of programmed to keep ourselves in that middle comfort zone, aren't we? Rather than, going into that fight or flight zone where we're making decisions that could jeopardize our financial security or our physical security or, our job or our position in an organization. So yeah, often asking ourselves, is this about growth or is this about comfort? I think is really important.
You wrote Switch, a top 10 Amazon bestseller about helping leaders bring their leadership and communication style into the 2020s, a distillation of a lot of ideas. Without giving away too much of what's in the book, obviously because we want people to keep going out and buying it, what are some of the key changes? You've already mentioned a couple of thought processes. Are there any other things that often crop up that you actually find critical?
Yeah, so the subtext of the book is to encourage leaders to move from telling people what to do to building trust. And, leaders nowadays are faced with a really dynamic workforce. We've got, I think by 2028 in Australia, we're going to have 5 generations in the workforce. When I left Aston in 97, 1 in 4 people had a university degree entering the corporate workforce. I'm a Generation X. And Generation Y, there's about 1 in 3 workers have a degree. And Generation Z, 50% of workers entering the workforce in Australia have a university degree. So already these employees are hardwired to want to be involved. They want to contribute. They want to help with innovation and change. So as a leader, having a powerful conversation is really about encouraging yourself to switch from telling people what to do to building trust in the organization. So asking questions and listening is a critical skill for leaders these days. So that's probably the biggest change, to accept that you're not the smartest person in the room. You don't know best, which is probably what the mantra of leaders was in 1997 when I started. And these days we had much more sophisticated and educated workforce. It's a pool for leaders to tap into rather than to dominate.
That's really interesting because my day job, as it were, impossible to believe they don't pay me just for doing this. But I'm a fundraiser. I'm on the fundraising and stewardship and donor relationship side of things.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of talk in the sector in the past few years about the next generation and how they view things differently, and they're much more interested in values. Do you see these kind of changing generational shifts over time maybe better because you're, I don't want to say detached, but you're not running the business, you're helping people with your ideas to run their businesses?
Yeah, and look, it's easier to sit on the sidelines and give advice to leaders rather than to be a leader yourself. But what I hope that I bring is, as you said, 25 years of corporate understanding. But also I spend a lot of time with leaders learning about their challenges so I can help other leaders beyond who they are. And it's interesting what you talked about before just now is that what used to light employees up, let's just say when I joined the workforce, I used to focus on my weaknesses. I used to focus on my pay. That was motivating. I used to focus on my benefits package. Those were the things that lit me up as an employee. Nowadays, there's an enormous wealth of research that shows that employees are more interested in purpose. They want flexibility in the workforce. They're inspired by focusing on their strengths, and they want to focus on the organization vision and work for an inspiring leader rather than be managed.
Paul, you alluded to this earlier. You touched on powerful conversations. I love the sound of that just from the name. I know that's a big part of what you do in your work. What are powerful conversations and how can they help people?
Yeah, I hear a lot, Abby, managers saying, the most important conversation I have is the performance review, that difficult conversation that you might have twice a year. That isn't actually making any difference to performance and engagement in a team or an organization. What drives that performance and culture is the day-to-day conversations that managers have, not those 2 difficult ones we have a year. And so what I'm trying to do with powerful conversations is encourage leaders to switch from that telling to trusting mindset. Give them that opportunity to embrace a growth mindset, to align their conversations with the workforce. And that includes 4 things. The first is to switch your mindset to become a growth mindset. And I believe every manager, no matter what level you work at, can get better. The second aspect of that is building a deep connection with your employees. When I talk to managers about communicating, they default to speaking and talking. That's the last skill that I want to help managers with. It's actually about listening, thinking, and giving employees space and time. So building a much deeper connection is going to make sure that managers' communication is more on point. The third aspect is around focusing the agenda. I know that managers talk about so much with their employees, but actually focusing their agenda on some key things, like aligning with the business vision and the needs of employees, is going to help them move further faster. The last one is leading the conversation. So rather than just ambling through your day or your month or your year, being really specific that you've got what I call the leadership infrastructure to have regular, frequent, purposeful conversations with the team. So those 4 aspects really help the manager have a much more powerful conversation.
You recently posted an article on LinkedIn about managers missing the basics. It was 69% of the group of leaders that I surveyed said their teams don't know how their performance is being measured, and 40% said their teams didn't know how to make their contribution to the business vision.
Yeah.
This just sounds like we're basically tapping you up for loads of free advice, but I was really interested by this. If there's any leaders out there and they're listening and they think, yeah, that's probably sounds about right, what's one thing they could do to change that?
The one thing, I mean, that's from the research you're talking about, is 100 leaders in 100 organizations. And the one thing that I would give free advice to leaders right now is to be more purposeful. Ensure that your conversations have intent, that they're aligning, around the vision of the organization, the role that people play in the organization, what their contribution is, and how their performance is going to be measured. They're 4 things to help build real clarity in the workforce, because if employees aren't clear, then they can't be anything. And I keep saying that employees aren't telepathic, so get clear in the communication.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Paul, everybody has parts of their job that they love and parts of their job that they perhaps don't love as much. I don't know if this will be the case for you after what you said about designing your life in a really purposeful way, but are there parts of your job that you love and parts of your job that you would rather not do?
Yeah, of course. I'm at the end of the day, even though I'm running a coaching practice, you still got to pay the bills. And so like any other small business, I'm subject to the peaks and troughs of the economy, corporate spending, and all of that stuff. So when you run your own show, you don't just have to be a coach or a speaker on a stage or writing a book. You still have to generate sales. You still have to run your profit and loss account. So that kind of the back end of my business isn't the bit that lights me up. It's actually this kind of stuff where I'm having great conversations and helping people understand how to be better leaders. So those are the kind of the yin and yang, I guess, that I like or dislike.
Yeah. What is the best part of what you do? Because I know you do workshops, you do public speaking, you have one-on-one sessions. Which of those things lights you up the most?
Yeah, it's definitely the one-on-one coaching that I like the most. I'm really passionate about helping people get better. That's the title of my newsletter. And so when I see somebody that comes to me struggling with something, walking at their side with them for 3, 6, or 12 months is really satisfying. I like that.
That's lovely. So we ask the same 3 quickfire questions to each of our guests. But before we get into that today, we did want to let our listeners know about Astonbury, didn't we, Geoff?
We did indeed.
We did indeed. It is being dubbed as the ultimate summer celebration. It's happening on campus next month, Friday the 7th and Saturday the 8th of June. And alumni, you are invited. Across the 2 days, we'll have food, music, entertainment from DJs. The Aston clubs and societies are involved. We've got Omar Lay headlining, which is a big deal. And it promises to be a really fun time. So if you enjoy fun and you fancy a trip down memory lane on campus, round up some friends because we would love to see that. Paul, it's a shame you're so far away. Do you have any trips to the UK planned?
Not planned, but I wish I was coming to Astonbury. Sounds like a bad plan.
Okay, we will leave a link in the show notes, folks, for you to find out more, see the full schedule and get a ticket if you're interested. But Geoff, I'll hand over to you for kicking off the quickfire questions.
Thank you. Paul, we always wrap up. We've got the same 3 questions. We just fire them out there as fast as we can. Number 1, the most valuable lesson you've learned throughout your career.
Focus on doing 3 things, not trying to boil the ocean.
Oh, I like not trying to boil the ocean. I'm learning so much from you today, Paul.
I'm all about simplicity. Doing a few things is really important to me. Rather than trying to win a gold medal in 10 sports, just go hard in one.
Makes sense.
And what's next for you?
Next is my latest book, which I'm writing at the moment. It's all about curiosity and how to have a more curious conversation, better problem solving in teams by individuals.
That sounds great. And where can people find you if they'd like to connect or find out more?
You can look me up on LinkedIn or look at my website, which is paulmatthews with a double T.com.au.
Okay, brilliant. That is all the questions from us. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us on the pod. you're now free to go and enjoy wine time. We will leave links in the show notes for everyone to find out more about Paul and get your tickets for the ultimate summer celebration that is Aston.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks a lot.